Greetings, everybody. I will be presenting impact findings from an intervention that layered nutrition and behavior change communication onto a women's self-help group-based livelihood project in India. This is joint work with Agnes Kisambing, Kalyani Raghunathan, Sam Scott, Purnima Menon, Shivani Gupta, Jiang Kai, and the larger Wings study team. This is in the context of a larger project called WINGS, which stands for Women Improving Nutrition Through Group-Based Strategies. An overarching objective of the WINGS study was to understand the pathways to impact from women's group-based interventions on nutrition outcomes for women and children. And under this project, we had three components. The first was to develop a conceptual framework that links the women's group-based interventions to nutrition outcomes, and then to synthesize the literature around this framework and to identify gaps. The second component was to conduct a rigorous impact evaluation that provides evidence on the pathways, which is what I'll be talking about today. And the last was to highlight relevant lessons for investments in women's collectives in India and worldwide. This is the conceptual framework that we developed that linked women's group-based interventions to nutrition outcomes, where we identified 4 distinct pathways that might be triggered based on the intervention components. These are represented by the green horizontal panels. In addition to these direct pathways, we also identified cross-cutting pathways that are shown in the vertical yellow bar, which are building social capital, taking collective action, and empowering women. And we hypothesized that these would be triggered irrespective of the intervention components, just by the virtue of these interventions being delivered through women's group-based programs, which in a sense are bringing women together, building their social capital, and also empowering them. To give you a brief overview of what the intervention was, the nutrition intervention intensification model, as I mentioned before, was essentially layering nutrition behavior change communication onto existing women's group-based livelihoods project that was being implemented by a large NGO called Pradhan in India. The nutrition behavior change was delivered by trained volunteers called Pushan Sakhis that convened self-help group meetings and provided this information during these meetings. In addition to providing nutrition behavior change through these messages, Pradhan also integrated this the nutrition messaging throughout its focus areas, such as the livelihood and health, entitlement, and gender. And there was additional focus on community engagement and strengthening of higher level federations. This gives an overview of the project sites. So this was conducted in 8 districts across 5 states in India. Within each district, we selected 3 blocks, which were each from the control group where there was no Pradhan presence. One was from Pradhan standard areas where there were no nutrition intensification happening, and then the last was the arm where the nutrition intensification model was implemented. On the right side, you see how the survey was structured. So in 2015 is when we did the baseline survey, where we interviewed 2,744 women who ever married women in the age of 15 to 49 years. And then we followed them up at midline, which was 2017, and then again at endline in 2019. In addition to this panel data, we also interviewed women with young children and in the age group of 6 to 23 months at midline. And this was restricted just to the NI and the standard arms, so the Pradhan areas. And then this was repeated again at endline just to get a sense of whether behaviors and practices were changing in this specific demographic. The primary outcomes for the WINGS evaluation were women's BMI and their diets. So diets were measured using dietary diversity indicator, which is number of food groups out of 10 food groups that were consumed in the previous 24 hours. We also measured minimum dietary diversity, which is defined as having consumed at least 5 or more groups in the last 24 hours. And then the main research questions for this evaluation are represented by this diagram. The first was, what was the impact of Pradhan's intervention when the standard and the NI approach is taken together on the outcomes of interest relative to the control? This is reflected by the vertical arrow, thing here. And then the second question was, what is the added impact of DNI intervention over and above the Pradhan score model, which is reflected by the comparison, the horizontal comparison. Very quickly, looking at the impact results of the intervention. The top set of bars are showing you the impact of the Pradhan areas compared to the control areas, and the bottom ones, which are represented by the orange and green bars, is showing the impact of the NI, the nutrition model, over the standard model. And what we find is that there was no impact on women's BMI in either of the comparisons, or on the prevalence of underweight in either of the comparisons. Then we move on to women's diets, and we find that the picture is pretty much the same with diets as well, where we do not find any impact of the Pradhan model over the control areas. We do find when we restrict the sample to just comparing nutrition intensification arm with the standard arm, we find that there was a positive impact on consumption of amino. So we've look into our data and try to examine, could it be low exposure, that women were not exposed to the messages, so how can they change behaviors? Or could it be that they were exposed, but the retention was poor? Or was it a combination? And we think it's a combination of the two. So the exposure to the intervention-specific messages was highest in the NI arm, but still consistently low at less than 25% of the sample. Exposure to child feeding and early marriage and pregnancy-related messages were uniform across arms, so there weren't any significant differences across arms. And we find no impacts on the knowledge on breastfeeding or animal food consumption practices. So we feel that it's a bit of both. The exposure was low, and then whatever was heard probably wasn't retained as much. In addition to looking at the primary outcomes, we wanted to explore impacts along the pathways to understand if we didn't have impacts, what driving these results. And here we have some mixed findings, where we find positive impacts along the agriculture pathway, with food security improving and some improvements around home gardens. There's also positive impact on income, with consumption expenditures improving. Whereas there are some negative impacts on livestock ownership. Along the rights pathway, there is some positive impact on the awareness of government schemes, but we did not find any impact on women's empowerment. So what can we take away from this evaluation? So one of the main criticism of targeting messages around the first 1,000 days, which should be targeted to younger women, and then when you do it to a group of women who are in SNCs, who are much older, comes the question, is it even relevant to them? So it's important to tailor the messages to the right type of group that is being targeted to. Initially, when the project was being designed, it was hoped that women in these groups will become agents of change, and then they will disseminate or diffuse these messages in their communities, but we do not see a lot of that happening. So, and then even if the right messages were delivered to the right people, the impact really depends on intensity and duration. And the intervention as designed was a very light touch, with one messages being delivered every month and not being reinforced very frequently or ever. Then an important consideration is that we need to go beyond the women. When there are decisions around nutrition, we need to bring in other family members. Importantly, the men in the households need to be sensitized as well. And this was a major limitation of this intervention, where it was only targeted to women. The second point is, does improving knowledge lead to better results and better changes in our actions? Is that the only missing link? And we find over and over that it's not just the information, but also the resources. So perhaps it's a resource constraint. Time is a constraint. Changing social norms of what kind of foods should be consumed, how different practices, these are also socially ingrained. So just providing information might not be enough. We need to change these kinds of values. And then lastly, perhaps we need to think a little bit more in terms of the pedagogy. So are there other methods through which we can deliver? The individuals who were actually delivering these messages were from the community itself. Did they have the skill and the capacity to do so? Also, was the classroom type approach the best approach? Should it have been a more participatory type of a method, or more practical hands-on demonstration? So these are all open questions for further research, and thank you for your attention.